Before we proceed, there is a matter of utmost importance that needs addressing.
My mother took the microphone before the doors had finished trembling from the wind off the sea. By the time my father rose from his chair in the third row, 200 guests had already turned toward me, waiting to see whether I would break. The glass walls of the conservatory held the late afternoon light like a trap. Beyond them, the Atlantic heaved under a pale silver sky, restless and cold, as if the ocean itself had come to witness what my family had carried into this room. White orchids climbed the iron arches above us. Candles burned along the aisle in tall cylinders. Everything glowed. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked serene. Nothing was serene. Lorraine Rowan stood near the musicians with the microphone in one hand, her spine straight, her face composed, her pearl-gray dress falling in perfect lines. Anyone who did not know her would have mistaken her for a loving mother overcome with emotion. That was her gift. She could wrap cruelty in velvet and call it concern. Victor Rowan did not need a microphone. He never had. His voice had ruled boardrooms, charities, holiday tables, and every room I had ever learned to make myself smaller inside. When he stood, the silence shifted around him like people making space for power out of habit. "Eliza," he said, and my name struck the air like a verdict. "This wedding does not need to continue." For one sharp second, I felt every year of my life inside my body at once. Childhood dinners where one wrong word could freeze the room. Sunday phone calls measured by his patience. My mother smiling while she rearranged my choices until they looked like hers. The old instinct rose in me, cold and fast. Stay quiet. Stay careful. Stay small. But I was not a child in the corner of a room anymore. Father Bennett stood at the front with the ceremony book open in his hands. He was a narrow man in his 70s with kind eyes and a face trained by decades of weddings, funerals, and human foolishness. He did not rush to rescue me. He only looked at me, waiting to see what kind of woman I had come here to be. Adrian was not beside me. That absence was the blade my mother had chosen. 7 minutes earlier, Adrian had stepped into the East Service Hall after a call about his Aunt Miriam, the woman who had raised him after his mother died. Her heart condition had flared, and his cousin had panicked over the medication. He had leaned close, his hand warm against my wrist, and said he would be back before anyone noticed. He had looked guilty for leaving. I had told him to go. Now my parents had mistaken his brief absence for weakness. My mother lifted the microphone, her voice soft and shining. "We did not come here to humiliate our daughter," she said. "We came because love sometimes requires courage. Eliza has always confused defiance with independence, and today she is making a decision that will stain the rest of her life." A ripple moved through the guests. Shock. Discomfort. Curiosity. A few faces turned toward me with pity. Naomi, standing near the front in sea green silk, went still as stone. My younger brother Ethan stared at our father, then at me, as if a door inside him had opened and he did not like what he saw beyond it. Then the side door clicked. Adrian stepped back into the conservatory, shoulders squared, dark hair wind-touched, his expression calm in the way only truly dangerous men can be calm. He did not hurry. He did not explain himself. He only walked up the aisle, and as he passed the third row, my father looked straight at his face. I saw the recognition hit him. Not confusion. Not irritation. Recognition. The blood drained from Victor Rowan so quickly it seemed to hollow him out from within. His mouth opened, but no command came. His hand tightened around the chair back. In that instant, the room stopped belonging to him. Because he knew that face. Because he knew that name. Because the man he had dismissed as unworthy was the son of the one man he had once destroyed and never expected to see rise again through his daughter. I turned to Father Bennett and heard my own voice, low, steady, unshaking. "Please continue." The words were quiet. They changed everything. I learned very early that love in my family came dressed as discipline. In our house on Chestnut Street, nothing was ever loud unless it was important, and nothing was ever important unless my father said it was. The silver was polished every Saturday. The curtains were drawn at the same hour each evening. Even laughter seemed to arrive only after passing inspection. Visitors called our home elegant. They admired the dark wood floors, the oil paintings, the pale blue porcelain bowls my mother placed exactly 3 inches apart on the dining room sideboard. They never saw what lived underneath that order. They never saw how carefully a child could learn to disappear inside beauty. I was 11 when my grandmother died, and for years I told myself that was simply the first sad thing that had ever happened to me. It took much longer to understand that it was the day I was taught what my place in the world was supposed to be. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fading lilies. Outside the window, Boston was gray with rain, the kind that turned the glass into a sheet of trembling smoke. My grandmother lay small beneath the blanket, her breath thin, her fingers shaking against the cotton. I remember those hands more clearly than I remember her face that day. They were open. Waiting. My father stood near the wall speaking in a low voice into his phone about contracts and signatures, as if death were an inconvenience that should have had the courtesy to schedule itself elsewhere. My mother was in the hallway discussing insurance forms with a nurse, calm and efficient, already arranging the next necessary thing. I stood in the corner by the sink, my coat still on, my gloves clenched in one fist, staring at my grandmother's trembling hand and wanting with a force so fierce it hurt to go hold it. But nobody told me to. That was the rule in our family. Permission first. Feeling second. So I stayed where I was. I waited to be called forward. I waited to be useful in an approved way. By the time my mother returned and my father slid his phone back into his pocket, my grandmother's hand had gone still. No one blamed me. That was almost worse. They moved around me with their grief arranged into tasks, and I understood something terrible in the quiet center of that room. The people I loved most would always choose order before tenderness. If I wanted to keep them close, I would have to ask for very little and disturb nothing. That belief followed me into adulthood like a second shadow. It followed me to restoration studios where I spent my days repairing cracked canvases, lifting soot from varnish with a brush so fine it looked like a whisper. I became good at seeing damage other people missed. Good at patience. Good at saving what looked ruined. Colleagues called me gifted because my hands never shook. They did not know those hands had been trained by years of swallowing reaction before it reached the surface. I met Adrian Vale in Providence on a wet October evening at a symposium on preservation and design. I had gone because a museum client wanted me to sit through a panel on adaptive restoration, and I expected the usual parade of polished egos speaking about history as if it were a product line. Then Adrian stood up. He did not look like the others. He spoke without theatrical pauses, without the lazy confidence of men used to being admired for saying little. He spoke like someone in love with structure, with memory, with the moral responsibility of keeping a thing honest while rebuilding it. He said a building should never be restored into a lie just because the lie photographs better. Something in me lifted its head. After the panel, I asked him a question about salt air and old stone. He answered it carefully, then asked me about pigment decay in coastal collections. We talked through the reception, through the staff stacking empty glasses, through the rain beginning to strike the windows harder. By the time I reached my hotel room, my whole body felt strange, lit from within by a kind of peace I did not recognize. 3 months later, I mentioned him on a Sunday call. My father went quiet first. That was always more dangerous than anger. An architect, he said at last. Restoration work. Eliza, that is not exactly a serious future. He left the rest unspoken because he knew I would hear it anyway. Not serious enough. Not ambitious enough. Not worthy of the Rowan name. My mother sighed softly, as if my life had become physically heavier in her hands. She said I had always been sentimental about broken things. I almost apologized. That was the old reflex. The old training. The old girl in the corner waiting to be told where she belonged. Instead, I looked at my reflection in the dark window of my apartment and heard Adrian's voice from Providence saying that restoring something honestly meant refusing to paint over the fracture and pretend it had never been there. For the first time in my life, I ended the call before my father was finished speaking. My hand trembled after I pressed the button. Only for a moment. Then it became still. By the time Adrian told me the truth, winter had pressed Boston flat beneath a lid of dirty snow and early darkness. He came to my apartment on a Sunday carrying a bottle of red wine he never opened. That was the first sign. Adrian believed in finishing the small rituals of a day. He hung his coat neatly. He rinsed his hands if he came in from the cold. He opened the wine while I plated dinner, always offering me the first taste as if we were practicing for a life built from gestures too quiet for anyone else to notice. That evening, he set the bottle on the counter and left it there unopened, the glass dark as a held breath. I knew before he spoke that something had followed him into the room. The windows over my sink reflected the kitchen back at us in dim layers. Candlelight. White plates. Steam rising from pasta neither of us would eat. Adrian stood at the table with both hands flat against the wood, not looking at me yet, as if he were measuring the force it would take to split open the next few minutes. "There is something I should have told you sooner," he said. The words were calm. His face was not. Shame had sharpened it, drawn the warmth out of his mouth, left his eyes too still. I put down my fork and felt the whole apartment narrow around us. He told me his father's name first. Samuel Vale. The name meant nothing to me for almost 3 seconds. Then everything in his expression told me it was supposed to. I searched backward through memory, through overheard phone calls, old newspaper clippings glimpsed on my father's desk, sharp words exchanged at charity dinners when men thought children were too unimportant to understand. And then it came. Vale Restoration Group. A respected preservation firm. A vanished name. A scandal my father had once dismissed as unfortunate business. Adrian did not rush. He told me the story the way a man handles broken glass, carefully, piece by piece, determined not to cut the person receiving it more than necessary. 16 years earlier, his father had built a company known across New England for restoring historic properties without stripping them of their soul. Then Victor Rowan entered as a financial partner. There were contracts. Revisions. Board minutes. Clauses Samuel believed were temporary. Signatures placed beside promises that shifted shape after the ink dried. By the time the legal battle began, my father had already boxed him out of the company, seized the projects, and left the Vale name buried under debt and humiliation. Samuel lost the firm. Then the house. Then his health for a while. Adrian was 22 when he watched movers carry the last furniture out of a home his father had spent decades paying for. I sat very still. Not because I felt nothing. Because I felt too much all at once. Horror first. Then disgust. Then the colder thing beneath both, the thing that did not surprise me nearly as much as it should have. My father, I thought. Of course. I knew your last name early, Adrian said. I knew before I let myself love you. I kept thinking there would be a right time to say it, and every time I found one, I imagined your face and lost my nerve. His voice roughened on the last words. That hurt more than the story. Not his silence. His fear. Fear that loving me might cost him the life he had rebuilt. I asked him if Samuel knew about us. He shook his head. Not at first. Then he said yes, recently, but not everything. Not the engagement. Not the wedding date. Not that the daughter of Victor Rowan had become the woman he wanted to spend his life with. I turned away and looked out at the snow crusted against the fire escape. The city was black glass and street lamp gold. Somewhere below, a siren dragged its grief across the avenue. I should call your father, Adrian said. Tell him who I am before the wedding. Give him a chance to react in private. No, I said. He fell silent. For my whole life, I said, I have given my father time. Time to rehearse. Time to reposition. Time to make his version the official one before anyone else can speak. If he learns who you are before that day, he will arrive armored. He will control the room before we even enter it. Adrian watched me with a kind of grave attention that made lying impossible. And if he learns at the wedding, then he learns there, I said. In my light. On my day. In front of witnesses. The room went quiet enough for me to hear the radiator click. He asked if I was sure. I thought of my grandmother's hand lying open on the blanket. I thought of every silence I had mistaken for peace. I thought of my mother arranging cruelty into softer shapes. Then I looked at the man in front of me, a man my father had every reason to underestimate, and understood with sudden clarity that this was the first truly dangerous choice I had ever made. Yes, I said. Invite them. That night, after Adrian left, I addressed the envelopes by hand. Mine to my parents, his to the past my father thought had stayed buried. And when I slid both into the mailbox on the corner, the metal door clanged shut with a sound that felt less like fear than fate. The quartet had just reached the second movement when my mother decided the ceremony belonged to her. Until then, everything had been balanced on a blade. The conservatory glowed with late afternoon light, every pane of glass washed in pearl gray from the sea beyond it. White orchids curved over the aisle like frozen waves. Candles burned without flickering. 200 guests sat in careful rows, their silence polished, their attention trained toward the altar where I stood alone for one impossible stretch of minutes while Adrian was still in the East Service Hall helping his aunt's nurse confirm the correct dosage for her medication. I had told myself I could hold that absence. What I had not accounted for was how quickly my mother would read it as opportunity. Lorraine Rowan rose from the third row with the serene purpose of a woman walking towards something she already believed was hers. By the time the event coordinator understood what was happening, my mother had reached the microphone stand near the musicians and lifted the wireless microphone free in one smooth motion. Her face was soft with grief so perfectly arranged it might have fooled God. I am her mother, she said, and the room froze around her voice. If I do not speak now, I will regret it for the rest of my life. A murmur passed through the guests and died just as fast. Father Bennett looked at me, then at her, his fingers still resting on the open ceremony book. Naomi half rose from her seat, furious already. Ethan did not move. He sat with his shoulders tight, staring at our mother as if seeing not a parent but a performance. My mother turned toward the room, not toward me. That was the cruelest part. She was not speaking to her daughter. She was shaping an audience. We did not raise Eliza to throw herself away, she said. We did not give her every advantage, every protection, every decent thing, only for her to bind herself to a man whose history she does not understand and whose presence in this family is an insult to everything her father built. Then my father stood. Victor Rowan did not snatch attention. Attention bent toward him on instinct. He stepped into the aisle in his dark suit, one hand buttoning his jacket, face hard with that cold paternal disappointment he had used all my life like a private weapon. This ends now, he said. Eliza, if you walk out with us, we can still contain the damage. Contain. Not heal. Not mend. Not forgive. Contain. That one word stripped the room bare. I saw it land on faces across the conservatory. Friends from the museum board. My colleagues from Boston. Donors. Neighbors. People who had known my family for years and were, perhaps for the first time, hearing the machinery underneath our elegance. My pulse beat once in my throat. Twice. I felt the old training rush up, the old terror that if I moved wrong the whole room would turn and name me ungrateful, dramatic, cruel. For one splinter of a second I was 11 again, waiting in a corner to be told whether I was allowed to cross a room. Then the side door opened. Adrian stepped back into the conservatory with the salt wind behind him. His hair touched by rain, his expression still and unreadable. He closed the door softly. No apology. No panic. Only presence. He began walking toward me. He passed the last row. then the next. My father watched him with irritation first, then disbelief, then something far uglier. I saw the exact moment recognition struck. It moved through Victor like a blade entering cleanly between ribs. His face emptied. His jaw slackened. One hand slipped from his jacket. "Veil," he said. It was almost soundless. But in the silence, everyone heard it. Adrian did not look at him. He came all the way to the altar and stopped beside me. His hand found mine, warm and steady, his thumb pressing once against my knuckles as if to say, "I am here now. I am not leaving again." Behind us, my mother's breath caught. Ethan stood up so suddenly his chair leg scraped the floor. And I understood then that the real collapse was not mine. It was my father's. Because the man he had dismissed as too ordinary, too small, too unworthy had just walked back into this room carrying a name my father had spent 16 years hoping would never stand in front of witnesses again. I turned to Father Bennett. "Please continue," I said. He held my gaze for one measured second, then nodded and lowered his eyes to the book. "Dearly beloved," he began. And just like that, the ceremony moved forward. Not because my parents were finished. Not because the wound was small. But because for the first time in my life, they were no longer the ones deciding what happened next. By the time the reception began, the sky beyond the conservatory had turned the color of bruised steel, and the sea was no longer visible as water so much as movement. You could hear the wind worrying at the glass between bursts of music and conversation, as if the storm that had failed to enter the ceremony was now circling outside, looking for another way in. Inside, everything glittered. Champagne moved on silver trays. Candlelight trembled over crystal. The long tables shone with white linen, blown glass, and low arrangements of orchids and winter greenery. Anyone walking in at that moment could have mistaken the evening for a triumph polished smooth. But the air carried that strange electric weight a room acquires when truth has already entered and no one knows yet where it will sit down. Adrian stayed close enough that I could feel the heat of him before I touched him. His hand rested at the small of my back, quiet, protective, never possessive. We moved through congratulations, embraces, whispered astonishment, and the careful, bright tones people use when they are trying not to look directly at the wreckage of someone else's family. Then Adrian leaned toward me and said, "My father came." I turned toward the entrance. Samuel Vale stood just inside the doorway in a dark wool coat damp with mist, one hand still curled around the handle as if he had not fully decided he belonged there. He was older than Victor in the way honest hardship ages a man. Not broken. Worn into truth. His face held none of my father's hunger for command, none of that restless need to dominate a room before it judged him. He simply stood there, looking for his son. Adrian crossed to him first. They clasped each other's shoulders, and in that small, wordless exchange I saw more tenderness than I had ever witnessed between my own father and brother in all the years of my life. Ethan saw it too. My brother had been silent since the ceremony, moving through the reception like someone who had walked into a house he thought he knew and found entire walls missing. Now he stepped forward before I did. He extended his hand to Samuel. His voice was rough when he introduced himself, as if each syllable cost him something. Samuel took his hand with quiet grace, and Ethan lowered his eyes for one brief second, ashamed perhaps not of what he had done, but of how long it had taken him to see. When the speeches began, the room settled. Naomi spoke first, all warmth and steel, making the guests laugh and then nearly cry in the span of a minute. After her, one of Adrian's cousins offered a story from childhood that loosened the room further. The tension thinned but did not vanish. It waited. Then someone asked whether Samuel would like to say a few words. He stood slowly, not with performance but with care, the way a man rises when he understands the floor matters. The microphone looked almost too polished in his hand. "I do not know most of you," he began, and his voice was low, even, unmistakably real. "But I know what it costs to build something with love and to watch someone stronger decide it belongs to him." The room went still so completely that even the staff stopped moving. He did not dramatize. He did not accuse with heat. That made it worse. Better. Truer. He spoke of the company he had built over decades, restoring old buildings without hollowing out their history. He spoke of trust placed in the wrong hands. Of contracts twisted. Of years lost. Of a house emptied room by room while his son was still young enough to believe decent men were protected by the truth. No one looked at me then. They looked at Victor Rowan. My father had been standing near the far end of the room with a glass in his hand and my mother beside him like a shadow that had not yet chosen whether to stay attached. He did not move at first. He only stared at Samuel as if he could will him smaller by refusing to blink. Samuel turned then, not toward Victor, but toward Adrian. Then toward me. "What I want to say tonight," he said, "is not about what was taken. It is about what remained. My son remained. His character remained. And this woman," he added, looking at me with a kindness so steady it nearly undid me, "chose the truth even when she knew it would cost her peace. That is courage. Not noise. Not control. Courage." He raised his glass. "To Adrian and Eliza. And to every life that begins the moment fear stops running it." The room rose with him. Glasses lifted. Chairs scraped back. A wave of people stood, and in that rising sound I heard something I had never once heard in my father's presence before. His authority breaking. Victor did not raise his glass. He set it down with terrible care on the nearest table, turned, and walked toward the exit. Not fast. Not furious. Worse than that. Diminished. A man leaving a room that had finally seen the outline of him clearly. My mother stood frozen for one heartbeat, then two. She followed him out. The reception breathed again, slowly, uncertainly, like a patient. After a long compression of pain. Music resumed. Someone laughed too loudly from relief. Naomi wiped at the corner of one eye and pretended she had not. 10 minutes later, the side door opened. My mother returned alone. Without my father beside her, Lorraine looked smaller, though nothing about her posture had changed. She came toward me through the candles and flowers with none of her earlier certainty. Up close, I saw what I had never seen on her face before. Not innocence. Not even regret exactly. Disillusion. "I did not know," she said. Her voice was soft, stripped of polish. It trembled once and settled. For the first time in my life, my mother sounded like a woman speaking rather than performing. I believed her. Not fully. Not enough to heal the wound in one night. But enough. "Not tonight," I said. 2 words. Not forgiveness, not exile. A boundary. Her eyes filled, though no tears fell. She nodded once, then turned and walked back into the dark beyond the glass. Later, after the dancing, after the last toast, after the candles had burned low and the sea had become only sound, Adrian and I stepped outside onto the stone terrace. The air was cold enough to bite. Behind us, the reception glowed gold through the conservatory walls. Inside were laughter, music, and a future I had chosen with my own hands. For years, I had mistaken silence for safety. Obedience for love. Endurance for strength. I knew better now. Strength was not pleasing the people who built your cage. It was opening the door while they were still insisting it was locked. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, tell me in the comments which one cost you more. And if stories like this one speak to something quiet and fierce inside you, like this video, subscribe to Still Waters Payback, and come back for the next reckoning.